Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I asked my parents for help so I could stay alive and keep working, and they told me they had nothing. They looked me in the eye and said it was just bad timing, that they wished they could help, but there was simply no way. I walked out of that conversation thinking, fine, I'll figure it out myself. I'll tighten my budget, I'll take on side work, I'll do whatever it takes, because what choice did I have? But here's the part that still stings, and it will probably never stop stinging. A few weeks later, they proudly announced they had just bought my brother a vacation house. Not helped him rent a place, not loaned him money for a down payment, but actually bought him the house outright and called it a family investment. When I first heard it, I thought maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. I wanted to believe I was wrong, because the alternative was unbearable. But no, I hadn't misheard anything, because my mother made sure everyone knew exactly how much they had sacrificed to make Jason's dream possible, and my father nodded along like a silent partner signing the deal. And there I was, standing with stacks of medical bills, wondering how I was going to make rent that month while keeping up with treatment, realizing that the people who raised me had chosen a vacation property over my health. I didn't explode in that moment. I didn't cry in front of them. I just went quiet, because I finally understood something I had been dancing around my whole life. In our family, Jason was the investment, Jason was the golden child, and I was expected to survive on scraps and gratitude. So I made a decision that night. If they were not going to help me, I would stop asking. I would stop explaining. I would stop giving them chances to pretend they didn't know what I was going through. I would find my own way to cover every single bill, and I would not let them see me break. That doesn't mean it was easy. It meant picking up extra hours at a second job even when I was exhausted from appointments. It meant cutting down on things that already felt like luxuries, like dinners out with friends, or even just buying new clothes when the old ones wore out. It meant living on a kind of discipline I didn't know I had until I was forced into it. And every time another bill came in the mail, I told myself, you will pay this on your own, and you will remember who looked you in the eye and told you they had nothing to give. I wish I could tell you that choosing strength over dependence felt good right away, but the truth is it felt lonely, and it burned in a way I can still feel. I stopped answering calls as often. I stopped showing up to family dinners where Jason's new house became the main topic of conversation, because I couldn't sit there and listen to them call it our getaway place when they had refused me basic help. And yet, as much as I pulled back, they kept acting surprised that I was distant, like it was some mystery they couldn't solve. The thing about pulling away, though, is that it gives you space. And in that space, something started to shift. I began keeping records, every statement, every denied claim, every receipt for the payments I made. Not because I thought I would ever throw it in their face, but because I needed a reminder that I was carrying this weight myself, that no one else could take credit for what I survived. And maybe, deep down, I also knew that proof has power, and one day I might need it. So that's where I stood, paying my own bills, cutting corners, and watching my parents beam about Jason's new property like it was the crown jewel of the family legacy. They wanted me to come celebrate, to walk through the house, to pose for photos in the backyard, and act like it belonged to all of us. But I refused. I told them directly I wouldn't be attending, and when my mom pressed me for a reason, I gave her the only one I could. I needed to focus on my health and couldn't spend money or time on a vacation house I didn't ask for. I thought that was the end of it, but then something happened that cracked the whole thing open. A week later, an envelope showed up at my apartment with my name handwritten on the front and a return address that stopped me cold. It wasn't from my parents. It wasn't from Jason. It was from someone else in the family who almost never reaches out. I remember staring at that envelope, heart pounding, because I had no idea what was inside, but I knew it mattered. And when I finally tore it open, what I found made everything worse, and at the same time, it gave me the first real piece of leverage I had ever held in my life. When I finally slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the papers that had been tucked inside, I saw a neat little note in my aunt's careful handwriting that said almost nothing and yet said everything, because there was my name, there was the date circled, and there was a photocopy of a cashier's check with a memo line that spelled out, in the bland tone of a bank window, that the funds were for a down payment on Jason's vacation house, which meant I was not crazy, I was not bitter, and I was not inventing insults out of thin air, since the money that was supposedly impossible to find when I needed help had materialized quickly and quietly when the golden child decided he needed a place to rest his head near the water. And the relief that washed over me, if you can call it relief, felt like finally standing on a floor that did not give under my feet, even as the anger rose because the floor led to a door I had not planned to open. I read the note again, not because there was more to it, but because the restraint inside those 2 lines told me my aunt understood the price of being the messenger in this family. And it made me wonder how many conversations had happened behind closed doors about what to do with me, the difficult daughter who kept asking for help without crying or breaking, the one who would not explode publicly and therefore could be managed with silence and cheerful announcements, and I will admit that I sat a long time with those photocopies, letting my stomach cool down from a slow boil to something sharp and useful, since information is only power if you do not waste it on speeches that make the other person feel righteous. I could have driven straight to my parents' place and thrown the paper down on their kitchen table, and in earlier years I probably would have done exactly that because I believed, like an idealist with a head injury, that showing someone the truth would force them to change. But now I understood that people who are committed to a story do not abandon it when the facts arrive. They just pay a higher price to keep the story running. And that was the moment I decided to stop auditioning for the role of reasonable daughter and start acting like a person whose energy is not a community resource. So I took photos of every page. I saved them in a folder with a boring name that would not draw attention. And I placed the originals in a plain envelope that I labeled with one word: receipts. Then I did something that felt small in the doing and huge in the aftertaste, because I opened the family chat. The one that had turned into a stream of smiley photos from Jason's new deck and silly countdowns to the first barbecue and half jokes about who would claim the blue room. And I wrote a message that did not breathe fire, did not accuse, and did not invite an argument, saying that I was focusing on my treatment plan, that I would not be available for gatherings or errands for a while, that I loved them but needed quiet, and that I would not discuss budgets or lifestyle choices with anyone. And then, before the responses started piling up with their little pings and their loaded friendliness, I did something I had never allowed myself to do, which was to mute the entire thread and place it in a folder called Archive so that my phone could not be used as a remote control for my nerves. If you have never muted a family, let me tell you that the silence is not peaceful at first, because the mind plays a highlight reel of all the ways they will interpret your boundary as an attack, and it is tempting to jump back in and repair the hurt you did not cause. But I made tea and told myself that taking care of my body also meant taking care of my bandwidth, and little by little a funny thing happened, which was that the space I had been using to apologize for existing started to open up for something else, and that something else was the kind of curiosity that does not come with drama, only with steady questions like where did the money come from, how was it moved, and what exactly did they think would happen when they asked me to smile in photos that would be sent to people who had already decided I was selfish for not applauding the investment. So I put my practical hat on, the one I wear at work when chaos hits a project and everyone wants to blame the calendar, and I made an unexciting list that began with medical bills and moved through insurance letters and landed on property records. Because gossip is air but documents are bricks, and if you are going to build something that stands, you need to stack bricks patiently, which is not glamorous and does not give you the same rush as a confrontation in a driveway. Yet every time I saved a PDF or clipped a statement or wrote down a date from a mailed notice, I could feel the noise inside my chest getting quieter, as if the part of me that had been begging to be believed realized she could stop talking and let the paper speak for her. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not friends, not coworkers, not even the aunt who had lit the match, and then stepped back, because secrecy was not the point, but privacy was, and the difference matters. Since secrecy is hiding out of fear while privacy is choosing when and how to share so that your story serves you instead of eating you alive, and somewhere in that quiet, I also made a second decision that tasted like steel, which was that I would not give away the anger for free by melting down on the phone with my mother, who is very good at turning any accusation into a plea for kindness, and I would not let my father move the conversation into weather and traffic, which is where hard men go when they do not know how to be brave. What I did instead was call my doctor's office, not to sob or dump feelings onto a nurse with 3 phones ringing, but to ask for a clean schedule and a written plan that I could follow without improvising. Because I needed my health to be a system rather than a constant crisis, and once the appointments were set and I had the calendar squared, I sat with my laptop and started a search that would have bored anyone who loves fireworks. Which is exactly why I knew it would work, and within a short time I found a public portal that lets you look up deeds and transfers, and I stared at the dry language that turns a house into lines and stamps, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I was inside the machinery instead of being dragged behind it. And, because the universe has a sense of timing that feels like a dare, it was only after I muted my family and committed to this unglamorous path that my phone lit up with a missed call from a number I did not recognize and a voicemail from a polite woman who said she was calling from a title office and wanted to confirm whether notices for the Parker file should still be sent to my address on record, which made me sit very still with the phone in my hand and ask myself a question I had not dared to say out loud, namely how exactly did my address become the place where those notices landed, and what else was already written down with my name on it that nobody expected me to ever see. And as I replayed her message and reached for a pen, I realized the story I thought I was living had just changed chapters without asking my permission. When I called the number back and the woman at the title office repeated her question in that professional tone that makes everything sound routine, I felt my throat tighten because the implication was clear. Somewhere in the paperwork connected to Jason's new house my name had been listed as the contact, which meant I was not just a spectator to their decisions, but, at least on paper, entangled in them, and although she probably expected me to answer quickly, I stalled long enough to hear my own thoughts run laps, because I had no idea what I was confirming or denying, and I realized in that moment that my parents and Jason had built their shiny little plan without considering that one day I might see the scaffolding holding it up. I asked her to send me the notices for now, just to be safe, and as soon as I hung up, I sat there staring at my desk, the anger simmering but layered with something new, something sharper, which was the awareness that they had not only lied about money but also, in their sloppy arrogance, left me a trail of documents that could unravel the image they worked so hard to polish. That night I opened my laptop and started organizing everything I had collected, not just the medical bills that came like clockwork or the insurance denials that read like polite insults, but also the screenshots of Jason bragging in the family chat, the copy of the cashier's check from my aunt, and now the call log from the title office. I did not think of it as revenge yet. It was more like putting pins on a map to see where the roads connect, because once you see a pattern you cannot unsee it, and the pattern here was that my family had resources they pretended not to have. And they spent them strategically to secure Jason's comfort while narrating to the extended family that I was independent, stubborn, or even reckless with money, which made my silence look like guilt and their generosity look like wisdom. The gossip reached me in fragments, usually through cousins or family friends who spoke without thinking, repeating my mother's lines about how I had chosen expensive doctors or refused simpler options, which made me want to laugh out loud because anyone who has ever dealt with the American healthcare system knows you do not choose anything. You survive a maze of referrals, copays, and fine print, but still, the damage was done. Because when relatives believe you are reckless, they stop asking how you are doing and instead start offering advice disguised as pity, and I knew my parents counted on that, since once the story stuck, they could keep funneling money to Jason without looking cruel. I wrestled with whether to confront them directly, but the memory of past conversations stopped me, because every time I had confronted my mother with hard facts, she shifted into that fragile tone that made me feel like I was breaking her heart. And then my father would step in, not to defend me but to redirect the discussion towards something safe, and Jason would either disappear or explode, both of which left me cast as the problem. I was not going to play that role again. So instead, I chose a tactic that felt both terrifying and liberating. I decided to make one statement in public, not to humiliate them, but to put a pin in the balloon of gossip. I waited for the right moment, which came when an extended family member posted a gushing note about Jason's amazing new place on our larger family page, tagging half the cousins and adding a line about how proud our parents must be. Normally, I would have ignored it, but that day I typed carefully, knowing exactly what I wanted to achieve. I wrote that I was doing fine, that I was working steadily, that I was covering my own treatment costs without outside help, and that I had no interest in discussing lifestyle choices with anyone because my focus was my health. Then I added one line, the kind that sounds innocuous but cuts deep when you know the backstory. I said I was happy for Jason's new property and hoped that every member of the family received the same level of support when they needed it. I hit post and closed my laptop before I could second-guess myself, and when I checked later the reactions were muted. A few polite likes, a couple of awkward comments, and, most importantly, silence from my parents. They knew what I had done, and they knew I had not accused them outright, but the implication was now in the room for everyone to sense, and the beauty of implication is that once planted, it cannot be uprooted without exposing the roots. I had drawn a line without throwing a punch, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was not playing their game, but forcing them to react to mine. Still, the satisfaction was mixed with a deeper unease, because the title office call had cracked open something larger, and as much as I wanted to believe my parents' betrayal ended with a cashier's check and a smug housewarming, I had a sinking feeling that the paperwork contained more than just their hypocrisy. So I started digging, not in anger, but in discipline, combing through property records like a paralegal in training, writing down parcel numbers, dates, and transfer notes, and that is when I noticed a phrase that made me sit up straighter. Beneficiary interest by descent. I knew enough to recognize the wording pointed back to my grandmother's estate, which had been split between me and Jason years earlier, but which my parents had always handled with the kind of vagueness that keeps inconvenient questions at bay. If the money used for Jason's house had passed through accounts tied to that inheritance, then legally my name was not just on a mailing list, it was tied to ownership. And if that was the case, then their whole performance about sacrifice and generosity was not just selfish, it was sloppy, and sloppiness leaves doors open. I closed my laptop and leaned back, feeling the strange mix of dread and excitement that comes when you realize the ground beneath the family's perfect photo is not solid, but riddled with cracks, and for the first time, I began to see a path where the power did not rest entirely with them. What I did not know, at least not yet, was that the next phone call would confirm it, and that the tidy house on the lake was less of a sanctuary than a liability waiting to be called in. And as I looked at the folder of receipts on my desk, I whispered to myself a truth I had never said out loud. If they wanted to pretend I was invisible, then they had made a mistake, because invisible people can move in ways you never see coming. When the second call from the title office came through, I already knew enough to brace myself, but even so I was not prepared for how calmly the clerk explained that certain documents tied to the property raised questions about beneficiary rights, specifically referencing language from my grandmother's estate file that listed both Jason and me as equal heirs to any assets purchased with proceeds derived from her accounts, and although the clerk spoke in the careful, neutral cadence of someone who deals with complicated family matters every day, I felt the weight of every word land like a stone because it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Namely that this so-called gift to Jason had not been carved neatly out of my parents' current resources, but instead had drawn directly from funds that were supposed to belong to both of us. Funds that my parents had either forgotten were traceable or arrogantly assumed I would never look for. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my apartment, the envelope from my aunt still on the table, my growing folder of receipts at my side, and for the first time in this entire mess, I felt something close to control. Not because I wanted to destroy them or because I needed vengeance for its own sake, but because they had built this entire stage on the assumption that I would never know my lines, and now I had the script in my hands. I called a local paralegal I knew through a friend, a woman named Marisol Rivera, who specialized in property disputes and estate transfers, and I told her the story without dressing it up, every denial of help for my medical expenses, every detail of the vacation house, every document I had collected. She listened without interruption, asked a few clarifying questions, and then said something that froze me and liberated me at the same time. If the funds came from that estate account, then you have a legal interest, and if they transferred it without your consent, that interest clouds the title until it is resolved. The phrase clouds the title stuck in my head because it sounded exactly like what I wanted: not thunder, not fire, not chaos, but a shadow across the perfect picture, one that could not be ignored or brushed away with a family dinner speech. Marisol explained that I did not have to file a lawsuit tomorrow. All it would take was a notice of interest, and suddenly Jason's vacation house would be a house with a question mark attached, which meant no easy refinancing, no smooth sale, no calm bragging rights. I asked her to draft a letter instead, something plain but firm, a message to my parents and Jason that either we acknowledged my rightful share and negotiated fair value into a medical trust for my care, or I would file the notice and let the legal system do the rest. When the letter was finished, it was not dramatic or flowery, but it was devastating in its simplicity. A statement of the inheritance terms, a reference to the title office's own findings, and a clear deadline for resolution. I sent it by certified mail, not to Jason's house, but to my parents' home address, because I wanted the envelope to arrive in the same mailbox where they once wrote checks for soccer uniforms and school pictures. The same mailbox where they had probably smiled opening congratulations cards for Jason's new property. The same mailbox where now sat proof that the daughter they thought was sidelined had moved to the center of the story. The timing could not have been sharper, because they had just finished planning a family weekend at the vacation house, complete with a photographer to take candid shots of everyone enjoying the lake, and the letter landed days before that trip, which meant the glossy celebration collided directly with a document that stripped away the polish. My mother called first, her voice strained and trembling, asking how I could do this, saying if I moved forward it would break the family, that Jason would never forgive me, that my father was already beside himself. I listened, but I did not argue, and when she finally paused, I said the one thing I had rehearsed quietly in my head: I am not the one who broke the family. I am the one asking you to fix what you already broke. The silence that followed was thick enough to make me wonder if the line had dropped, and when she finally whispered my name, I ended the call because there was nothing else to say, at least not until they answered the letter. For the first time, I felt a kind of power that was not loud or messy, but steady and undeniable, the kind that does not need to scream to be heard. I knew they would talk among themselves. Jason would rage, my father would go quiet, my mother would craft speeches about betrayal, but none of it mattered as long as the paperwork stood. That night I poured myself a glass of water and sat with the growing certainty that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and while a part of me mourned the illusion of family harmony, a much larger part of me felt stronger than I ever had before, because I was no longer trapped in their version of the story. I had taken the evidence, the receipts, the inheritance records, and turned them into leverage, and leverage meant I was not powerless, no matter how many years they had treated me that way. And as I placed the certified mail slip into my folder, I thought about the photo weekend they were about to have at the lake, the smiles they planned to capture, the laughter they hoped to freeze into frames, and I knew those pictures would carry shadows now. Because the paper under the paint had been exposed, and once seen, it could never be unseen. I went to bed that night not sure of what the next call would bring, but certain of one thing: they finally knew that the daughter they counted out had stopped asking and started writing, and that knowledge alone had already shifted the ground beneath their perfect vacation house. When the deadline in Marisol's letter reached the final day, and I had heard nothing but circular voicemails from my mother about love and family and legacy, along with 2 text messages from Jason that read like victory speeches rehearsed in a mirror before the game has even started, I walked to the copy shop on the corner with my envelope of documents and filed the notice that would cloud the title. And even though the clerk behind the counter treated it like any other piece of paperwork passing through her hands, I felt a clean click inside my chest, because this was not drama for the sake of attention. It was an adult boundary written in the language the house actually understood, which meant that the photos planned for the coming weekend, the carefree plans for a refinance, the gentle bragging about a home by the water, all of it now lived under a shadow they could not charm away, and I did not need to raise my voice to make it real because the county seal did the speaking for me, with a single stamp that made the picture imperfect in a way that mattered. Predictably, the first call after the filing was from Jason, who went straight to outrage the way some people go straight to dessert, accusing me of stealing from him, accusing me of jealousy, accusing me of needing attention. And I let him run until he circled back to the same 3 sentences he always uses when he feels cornered, at which point I told him calmly that the filing did not take anything from him. It simply paused his ability to treat our grandmother's money like his personal fountain, that I was open to a solution that did not involve courts or public embarrassment, and that if he wanted the cloud to go away, he could have it gone within a week by acknowledging my share and converting that value into a medical trust that would protect my care without placing me at the mercy of anyone's mood, which made him sputter and say he would never reward me for being cruel, and I said, as gently as I could manage, that if he was waiting for me to cry and apologize, he should block off the whole week because he would be waiting a long time. The second call was from my father, and it pulled at something old and soft in me because he has always preferred to stand in doorways rather than choose sides, and he started with a long sigh that sounded like the opening of a creaky porch screen, then asked if there was any way to fix this without lawyers, without documents, without unpleasantness, and I told him there was a very simple way to fix it that involved a clean transfer of funds into a trust managed by a third party, a release of my name from any residual claim on the property, and a written acknowledgement that the original use of inheritance funds had been handled carelessly without my knowledge, and I think the word carelessly helped him, because he could swallow that better than the word dishonestly, so he said he would talk to my mother and call me back, and for the first time in months I felt a real chance that this would end without me having to step into a courtroom or a family reunion ever again. It took 3 days and more drama than a small-town parade, but they agreed, not because they suddenly saw the light or discovered a hidden well of fairness, but because the cloud on the title was a practical problem that no amount of inspirational quotes could cure. And once their realtor confirmed that the cloud would complicate even the idea of using the house as collateral for Jason's next venture, my mother called with a voice so small it almost disappeared and asked what exactly the trust would require, whether it would be public, whether people would talk, whether it would make the family look like we were fighting, and I told her it would be quiet and boring and handled by a bank that did not care about feelings, and that the only people who would know were the people who already knew too much, and when she said she wanted one thing from me in exchange, which was a photo of all of us at dinner, smiling like nothing had happened, I felt a flash of old anger and then something colder and wiser, and I said that I could do dinner, I could do polite, I could do civil, but I would not pose in a house purchased with money that did not belong to him alone, which meant the dinner would be in the city at a place where the only things framed on the wall were menus and black and white photos of strangers. We met on a Thursday night, and I arrived with a folder that held 3 items, the signed release papers that would lift the cloud the very next morning, the bank confirmation showing the trust funded to cover my medical costs to date, plus a modest ongoing cushion that meant I would never again have to choose between a follow-up appointment and the electric bill, and a short letter I had written to myself. The kind of letter you write when you finally decide your worth is not a group project. And after the plates were cleared and my mother began her careful speech about forgiveness and moving forward and family memories, I placed the folder on the table and walked them through the contents without heat, because the win was not in the performance. It was in the precision, and when I finished I added one more piece of paper that surprised my mother into silence, a receipt for a donation made in her name to a patient assistance fund at the hospital where I had spent so many mornings. And I watched her eyes fill not with anger, but with the shock of being confronted by a version of kindness that did not beg for approval, a version that said I can be generous and still refuse to be used. I stood then, thanked them for meeting me, told Jason I wished him a peaceful life in his house and mend it, told my father that if he wanted to see me, he could call and we would have coffee without speeches, told my mother that I hoped the donation made her feel good because it certainly made me feel like something ugly had been converted into something clean, and when my mother reached for a hug I let her, Not because everything was fixed, but because I did not need to keep proving that I am a good daughter to be a good person, and then I left before dessert so that the last picture of me in their evening would be me walking away on my own terms. In the days that followed, the cloud lifted from the title as promised. The trust account began paying invoices in a rhythm that finally let me sleep. The family chat resumed its chirping about holidays and weather and Jason's grill. And every so often a message would appear asking why I did not visit the house or why I still kept some distance, and I would read it and feel a flicker of the old ache and then nothing at all, because the question had become meaningless now that the answer no longer required their permission. I did not visit because I did not want to. I kept my distance because the absence of chaos is not emptiness, it is peace, and the thing I wanted more than being right was being free, which I now was. Completely and without apology. If you are waiting for a moral, there is not one, because this is not a parable about forgiveness or family unity or the power of patience. This is a record of a woman who learned that love without respect is just a habit, and that the most devastating revenge is sometimes a precise correction delivered quietly and signed in ink. And if you want to know whether I ever set foot in that vacation house, I will tell you simply that I did not out of bitterness, but because walking into a place that once cost me my dignity would have felt like letting them repossess something they no longer own. And when people ask whether I went too far, I pour my coffee, smile to myself, and think about the trust account that pays my bills without drama. The small donation receipt framed on my wall where no one but me can see it, and the sentence I wrote in my letter and keep reading when the old doubt tries to sneak back in, which is only this: I know my worth now, and I am not bargaining it away again.